Hi, I'm Rudy Daniels, and if some of you are familiar with the activities of the Sioux City Railroad Museum, you know that during the spring through summer months, we have a series that are called Rail Yard Talks. And normally we would have these in the car shop or theater on the premises of the museum premises. And we would have a presentation on a railroad topic. And this is indeed part of the education theme and mission of the museum. But at the same time, it would give us a better idea of the meaning of railroad history, and more particularly railroad history here in Sioux City. Well, given the coronavirus this spring of 2020, that we're not able to meet as a group, as an audience, which really I prefer. Thereby, we would have the presentation, then we'd have questions, discussion, and so forth. Well, we can't do it now due to restrictions or various restrictions on numbers of people that can congregate together. So we have to do this means in order to do a program and to keep interest in railroad history as part of the mission of the Railroad Museum. I'd like to acknowledge first that we're going to see some photos during the program, and there are two areas from which I got these photos with permission to use, and one is the Sioux City Public Museum, and the other is the Andrew Railroad Center Museum in Boone, Iowa, permission granted by Mike Wendell, particularly from the collections of John Harker, R. Wilson Photography, Mel Hansen, Don Ross, and J.J. Buckley. I also want to acknowledge Bill Sibley, a friend of the Sioux City Railroad Museum, who recommended to me a book on Iowa trolleys. Even though this program is going to be on Interurbans, the Iowa trolley book does include Interurbans, and indeed it has a whole section on Sioux City trolleys and so forth from the turn of the century, over 100 years ago, and so forth, and even some photos from the 1940s. By the way, this book is available at the Sioux City Public Library if any of you are interested in looking at that. I also want to thank Larry Obermeyer, of course, who is the president and really the spark plug of these rail yard talks. And in speaking with Larry, we normally have as you know, a discussion question period. And discussing this with Larry, that we can't do this via our TV and reproduction today. What Larry has invited is that if you have any questions or comments, that you can direct them to me through him at the Railroad Museum, either by phone call or email or other means of your communication. And that's because Larry does want to keep track of the discussion and comments that these talks generate. And of course, any questions you have, discussion points, I'd be more than happy to answer, again, through the Sioux City Railroad Museum and Larry Obermeyer. Last, certainly not least, I want to thank G.R. Lindblade for their production of this program. Just wonderful that George is willing to do this for the museum and for myself. So thank you to all these people, and we can proceed with the program. Now, I was asked to do a program on interurbans and their meaning in American life by that Andrew Rail Center Museum in Boone, Iowa, last January. I am not an expert on what they call JUICE, that is, the electric interurbans and trolleys. And I was given just 2 months to try to put something together. And so I do not consider myself an expert, but just simply that we are going to use this program as kind of like food for thought. In other words, hopefully it will stimulate interest in this topic. And really it was through Larry Obermeyer. Larry, when I was asked to do this program, just a day or two later, Larry and I were having dinner, and Larry said to me, he said, "I'm really interested in the relationship between the steam railroads and interurbans." And he said, "I wonder if you could do something with that as you're doing your research." And it was a great idea, and we are going to look at that. But it also stimulated another idea that I had not seen any place in my research, and that is a comparison contrast between steam locomotive companies, that is the major railroad lines that we are more familiar with, let's say, and the interurbans. So we're going to look at that towards the end. So how we're going to proceed is some general comments about interurbans, definition, and then go on to some of the early experiments, that is before interurbans really became interurbans, just experiments with an electric motor on a cart, so to speak. And then we're going to look at some trends going on to the mature years, that is through World War I and into the 1920s, some of the changes that occurred among interurbans. And then we're going to mention some large or significant companies. Now, we can't mention all of them, obviously, but we can mention some of these companies. And then, as Larry Obermeyer suggested, the relationship between the steam railroad companies and interurbans. And then, as I mentioned, the comparison contrast with steam locomotives. And then perhaps something really interesting, something that hit me when I was doing this research, and that is the significance of the interurbans. Not just the significance in American life, and how they will change things, almost like a precursor to the automobile, but how the interurban as a vehicle, we're talking as a vehicle, a trolley as a vehicle, will change our whole perspective on life. That's quite a big statement. So let's start and let's move up to that big statement, along with our dessert of seeing some photos of interurbans. Let's start out. What is an interurban? Well, take the word inter, between, meaning between, urban, meaning areas where you have a significant population live, be it a town, it could be a village, it could be a large city. And that's basically what we're talking about here, basically an electric, we're going to say, car, or sometimes 2 cars or 3 cars, that will furnish transportation between 2 cities. You can say, wait a minute, steam railroads do that too. True. But there's something different about the interurban. And that is the importance of the interurban is not just the endpoints, the 2 towns or cities, it's what happens in between. Okay? Think of this. The steam railroad goes from town to town, station to station, picks up, drop off passengers at the stations. But the interurbans are going to pick up and drop off people in between the towns and cities through which they go. So that's a huge difference, and we're going to explore that. So 2 official definitions of this. One is the dictionary, and this is the Oxford Unabridged, the big one you can't lift. And that says a rail connection among 2 or more towns or cities. Very simple, akin to what we just talked about. Supposedly, a man by the name of Frank Duran, as an historian and entrepreneur, said that the interurban was a railway having less than half of its track within municipal limits. Well, I guess you could do a lot with that, particularly if your municipal limit is only a block or 2 downtown. Well, whatever. Here's something to consider in general comments, that over 90% of interurbans that filed articles of incorporation failed. Huge failure rate. If you talk about steam railroads, if you go back to the 1830s and 1840s, yes, you had failures after articles of incorporation. But overall, as far as failure, with that rubric, it's about 40% or less. So the interurbans had a huge rate of failure. The state that had the most interurbans was Ohio. Now, we see Ohio today as a huge industrial state, but we're talking about over 100 years ago when Ohio was still an agricultural state. Well, in fact, the whole United States, if you look before World War I, was still an predominantly agricultural economy. The farm still overshadowed industry in 1900. That's going to quickly change, and the interurbans are going to have something to do with that. So Ohio had the most interurbans, followed by Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Iowa was going to follow after that, but those were the main states, with Ohio having the most. As I said, the nation was changing from that rural setting, farm setting, to an urban city-town setting. And the interurbans are going to have a huge role in that. They're going to change the perspective of rural life. And that is, it brought the people of the rural areas quickly, safely, and easily to the town, which they couldn't do before because of roads being impassable due to weather conditions. And indeed, a horse and buggy could probably do 4 or 5 miles. And if your farm was more than 4 or 5 miles from a large area, city area or a town, you had to really be careful getting there. You had to take it to the train station, take the train to that other town, from one town to another. And the train station would probably in Iowa be about 4 or 5 miles more than your horse could do. So going to town before the interurban was really a task. So what the interurban is going to do is begin a fusion between the rural community and those in town. And that's because the major entrepreneurs who invested the building of the interurbans were the people in the town. This was a local enterprise, and that's because people in the town wanted to expand their marketing in market conditions by bringing people easily from the rural area, come into the town and to shop in their stores, use their products, or use their services. So really what the interurban did was bring about this integration, the 1890s, 1900 onto the 1920s, between the city and the town. You can say, well, automobiles did that. Yes, but later, because you didn't really have significant paved roads until the 1920s. So the interurbans started this movement from rural areas to town, convenience of going from rural area to town very easily. A farmer, family, whatever, would be standing along the track. The interurban would stop for them and take them for their farm, from the farm to town for shopping, or even commuting sometimes to work. Because remember, the economy is changing. Some people on the farm will go into town to work. Or, indeed, even going to a movie on a Friday or Saturday night in town and taking the late interurban back to near the farm area. Let's look at some early developments. Supposedly, one of the earliest was a man by the name of Thomas Davenport in the 1830s, who put a battery on a wagon on a rail, and had the wagon, had the battery churn a small motor, and the thing moved. Well, okay, very good. Well, that's a beginning. After the Civil War, Charles Page actually received $30,000 from Congress to build a battery car. And that battery car really was built, and it did go several miles. But there really wasn't anything left of it. In other words, it was a project that just died there. And of course, Mr. Page did get his $30,000 too. The problem was getting enough current to move a strong enough motor. And where we see this development was, again, after the Civil War, by a man named Moses Farmer, who actually used a dynamo to furnish current to an electric motor. Now we're getting someplace. So the idea now of using the battery is outmoded, and using current was the thing. And there were several experiments, particularly using a third rail, as they have in subways. But having that third rail above ground, brought all kinds of problems, shocking horses, shocking people who touched it, and so on and so forth. This was seen very quickly not to be a good idea to put a third rail attached to a dynamo on a street someplace. Not a good idea at all. And it was left to a Charles Van der Pol. And here you get a word really that's interesting. His name, Van der Pol. And here we're talking about now, yes, a trolley pole. He had the idea of suspending a wire and then having a pole, yes, a pole with an attachment to the wire, and that's how it would get its current. And this attachment and so forth was called a troller. And that's how the trolley got its name. Now, of course, later on, trolley would come to mean, yes, the attachment. Trolley would mean the pole itself. Trolley would mean the car. All kinds of things went along. In other words, the meaning of the word trolley was no longer specific to the one device. It simply expanded incredibly and whatnot, including such phrases as "off your trolley," as you know, that become common parlance later on. The practical aspect which brings about the Interurban was a man by the name of Frank Julian Sprague, who was really a naval officer who was working at the Thomas Edison laboratories. And those laboratories in Menlo Park, New Jersey are incredible. They're responsible for over 1,000 patents. And Sprague, working with Edison, developed a motor strong enough that would be practical to put on a car large enough to be able to move people at a good speed safely. And not only that, to develop this motor strong enough, he also developed a suspension system for this motor so that it could withstand any shocks or abrupt stops and so forth. So this made practical Interurban. And he built a 12-mile line for Richmond, Virginia, using DC polar current in 1887. He used a 500-volt motor, and he was able to contract to build 200 such systems for cities in 3 years. So this thing really grew like wildfire, using electricity and the trolley and whatnot with Sprague's more powerful motor and so forth. And here we enter the interurban era. Now there's going to be a lot of experiments with current, direct current, DC, AC, alternating current and so forth and whatnot. But by early 1900s, the more common system would be a dynamo generator sending current over wires, using transformers and other technical devices to furnish a 600-volt system, DC system, to the trolley motor. This is going to become the common system. And I want to add before I forget, there's one system left with 600-volt DC working in the United States today. And that's the Mason City and Clear Lake Railway. And that is still a system moving freight between Mason City and Clear Lake. It's a 600-volt DC system, the only one operating as a commercial venture today in the United States. There's some tourist lines that use it. Okay? At peak, the Interurbans, just around World War I, were responsible for 18,000 rail miles in the United States. But there will be a sharp decline, because by 1920 we're down to 15,400 miles, give or take. And on to the late 1920s, 12,300 miles. By the end of the 1930s, that is cut by 1/3, only 4,600 miles. So you have this very, very quick drop. Another measure would be the number of cars, and that is in 1910, factories such as Brill and others, Birney and other companies, were making 1,000 cars per year for Interurbans. This is going to drop down to indeed 500 cars by 1924. And that 500 cars even represents a movement from using wood to steel. So that's, you have to watch that statistic. The statistic is even worse than it looks, really, when you look at it. And when you get to the late 1930s, the factories are only producing 5 interurban cars per year. So by the 1930, definitely by the late 1930s, the interurban era is ending. In fact, by the 1920s, many of these interurbans were seeking freight. It began as passenger. 1920s, in order to survive, they were seeking freight. And here's something interesting, because as you know, by the 1920s, the automobile is coming into the picture. And this is what happened, that from World War I on, once you get those steel cars being manufactured, the technology of the interurban no longer changed, or very few changes. But you had the technology of the automobile changing and improving year by year, if you will. So as automobiles are becoming better, more efficient, easier to use, and so forth, the trolley simply stagnated. It did not grow. Here is one of the most incredible things that I found, was you would think that, my goodness, using electricity to move people, the trolley, wow, you know, electricity is coming of age. Thomas Edison, the light bulb. Oh, indeed, all types of electronic devices were coming into use by World War I. So why not use electricity? Why not the trolley? But that's not why it happened. It happened because starting in 1872, there was an epizootic epidemic in the cities. And this affected horses. Horses were dying by the hundreds. And the trolleys in the cities were being pulled by horses. So you had these horses becoming ill and dying within a day or two, if you will, of contracting this epizootic epidemic. And besides that, the horses were very expensive to upkeep, to feed, veterinary bills, and so forth. On top of that, the average lifespan of a horse, a team of horses pulling a rail car in a city with passengers, was about 4 years. Then that horse could no longer pull. It was no longer useful for the industry. So when this electricity came into use, it was cheaper, cleaner, obviously. You didn't have to clean the stable, you know, for that matter. And you didn't have veterinary bills or anything like that. So it wasn't just that electricity was fashionable, it was indeed important because it was cheaper than the use of horses, which was contracting this epizootic disease. On top of that, when you think about it, it was electricity that created the interurban, because horses could probably pull this thing for a couple of miles. And when you're talking about linking towns and the areas in between, you're talking about longer distances. You're talking more than 5 miles. In some cases, interurbans went hundreds of miles. And it would be incredible changing horses every 4 or 5 miles to operate an interurban, and at slower speeds. So electricity permitted the distance of an interurban to be created, and we're going to see, too, speeds, that the interurbans will achieve speeds akin to steam railroads. Maybe not exactly in all cases, but in some cases for experiments and for publicity purposes. Some interurbans had publicity runs of over 90 miles an hour. We're going to look at that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, trolleys developed in the towns. People, merchants and so forth, business people wanted to bring people from the rural area to town, obviously, to increase their business, to increase their cash flow. And it's also brought a mentality too occurring that people living on a farm were no longer isolated, going to town only a couple of times a year, only in fair weather. That now they could take this interurban into town to do shopping and other things and so forth. The problem with the interurban, besides the bankruptcies, is that they were constructed to trolley standards. The track was not built to steam railroad standards at all. It was cheaper to do it this way. And there was another reason too. And that is once that interurban reached town, overwhelmingly, like 98% of those interurbans, once they entered city limits, used trolley tracks. And that is very important. They would not have their own tracks into town, they would use the trolley tracks. Therefore, the interurban had to be a lighter vehicle, and we're going to see its size is going to be limited and so forth. Because here again, the entrepreneurs wanted people to come to town to do business, and they wanted an interurban to use the trolley tracks. So therefore, it was built to trolley standards. This is why the interurban cars could never be wider than that of the steam railroads, because the area between two trolley tracks in a town was more narrow than the area between the tracks of the steam railroads. This was often called the devil's strip, because you did not want to get caught between those tracks when two trolley cars were coming. What we're talking about is that cars could not be longer than 50 or 60 feet. There were a couple that were 70 feet, but mostly it was 50 and 60 feet. And indeed, only 8 feet 4 inches wide because of that devil's strip. But the reason for the shortness of the cars is because they had to make the sharp turns on the city streets, which of course steam railroads did not have to do. Also, most of these interurbans also had double operation like trolleys. The car could be operated at both ends. And similar to trolleys, had clear story windows for ventilation and so forth. They were attractive like trolleys in the sense of colorful paint schemes and so forth. They made little noise, except the whir of the motor, sometimes that sharp snap of the trolley bell, once it would start and whatnot. So it would seem to be really fashionable to take the trolley rather than that dirty Pullman green steam car with cinders and ash and all that from the steam railroads if one had a choice. The seats were comfortable, but most certainly not the comfort of the steam railroad, because most people took these interurbans relatively short distances. That is, they would be on that trolley or interurban maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, at most maybe 2 hours. So you didn't have to have super comfortable seats. Most of the seats were wicker or leather, and they did not lean back, or you couldn't lean them back and so forth, again, because of a short ride. There were very few parlor cars popular on the railroad around the turn of the century. On the interurbans, one Ohio line did have parlor cars and even a sleeper between Columbus and Zanesville. And Illinois Traction Company did have a sleeping car on its St. Louis Peoria line. So there were these rare occasions. Also, very few had any type of dining. And there was on the Indianapolis-Louisville line of the what is called interstate public service. But other than these, it was simply your bench seating, if you will. And in some cases, you would have two one seating, and in some cases, two seating on this and bench type seating. One other change that came about, in just about the same time as steam railroads, that we were going trend from wooden cars to steel cars. And this was the last real technological development of the interurban. Because, yes, the cars may be made out of steel, but the motor then had to be stronger to move these all steel cars and whatnot. So that's a last really big, important development in the interurban and whatnot. Now, the riders were mostly commuters. The conductors and motormen mostly knew the patrons who would take their line, right on their line, knew them, saw them every day in most circumstances, and so forth. And the fares in general, like here again, over 90%, were much cheaper than that of the steam railroads. Again, the idea was bringing the rural population into town to do business. And the lines tended not to compete with each other. If a city or town had 2 or 3 interurban lines, the franchises made sure that they did not compete with each other. In fact, the regulations of their operation, including frequency, and in many cases even the charges, ticket charges, were right in the franchise. That's important to keep in mind because in the late 19th century, when you have this battle over railroad rates and customers, you really didn't have that with the interurbans. In fact, one case was brought before the Interstate Commerce Commission involving interurbans, and afterwards the Interstate Commerce Commission said, no, we simply don't want to bother with this. This is regulated by local franchise and in some cases even by state regulations, so they simply did not want to bother with it. And very, very few interurbans went beyond state lines. That Illinois Traction did going into St. Louis. Now let's look at some big names in the interurban era. You know, we talk about big names. You know, in steam railroads, not to pick and choose, but such a name as a Union Pacific is a big name. Or such a name as a Pennsylvania or New York Central, big names. So let's look at some of the big names in the interurban era. One is the Cincinnati and Lake Erie. This was a huge enterprise that linked those cities with branches going to other cities, for example, Columbus and whatnot. And this line did exist well into the 1930s to World War II. And it was a comfortable, heavy cars, and it had publicity speeds going to the 90 miles an hour. No, not every day 90 miles an hour, but for publicity purposes. Most interurbans went between 20 and 40 miles an hour, depending upon their track. Another one was the Interstate Public Service Company that was built by Samuel Insull. He was the big person in charge of this Interstate Public Service Company. And he wanted to actually unify Indiana with his company. And it did operate into the post-World War II era. That Illinois Traction that we mentioned before with the sleeping cars to Peoria, they were really famous because in 1910, they built this incredible sturdy bridge crossing the Mississippi from St. Louis into Illinois. And Illinois Traction, besides having these sleeping cars and a power car, they also connected, if you could believe, 800 miles of rail in their system to their connections. Indeed, probably you would call the granddaddy is Pacific Electric. Pacific Electric actually centered in Los Angeles and ran at one time 1,126 trains. You can imagine. They had a stable of 3,262 cars. And they even had a 4-track main line in and out of Pasadena, California. It's an incredible, probably you could say the granddaddy of these interurbans. However, and we're going to get into this in a second with Larry Obermeyer's inquiry, that by 1910, the Southern Pacific Railroad took over the Pacific Electric. So it became a subsidiary of the steam railroad, Southern Pacific. And here's one for you that is still debated among interurban fans. And that is the Chicago New York Electric Air Line. And as you know from railroad history, airline did not mean that the train flew, although some went at incredible speeds. Airline simply meant that it was a straight line without curves between 2 points. So here they're talking about building an electric line from New York to Chicago, straight line. And they said that they were going to charge only $10 for 10 hours of riding that line. And that line would travel at the average speed of 90 miles an hour. And people invested in this. Right, it never happened. And many people believe that it was simply a scheme, a scam, if you will, to get money. There were other such airlines promised. One here in our area from Omaha to Denver that would compete with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy and Union Pacific, and one between Dubuque and Minneapolis, which indeed would have competed with the Chicago and Great Western and even the Milwaukee Road. These are some of the main or big companies of interurbans, all of which will be deceased in the post-World War II period. Now, let's look at Larry's inquiry. Let's look at that relationship between the steam railroads and the interurbans. Let's use a phrase probably grammatically incorrect, and that we'll call it very varied. They varied incredibly. That is, many steam railroads did not want the interurbans crossing their tracks, in other words, creating a diamond. Of course, railroads don't like diamonds anyway. Well, you know what I mean, the type that shine brilliantly, but not where the tracks meet. Huh? They don't like those type of diamonds, and particularly an interurban diamond where you got that wire overhead. So they didn't like that at all. And actually, there was actually arguments, lawsuits, there were even fisticuffs between interurban workers and the steam railroads when the interurban people tried to build a diamond. So right there, you have a conflict. Most cases, how this was solved was that the interurban would build an overpass over the steam railroads. And you can think about this in terms of even Sioux City, where our line to Morningside from downtown, yes, the celebrated elevated railroad, was elevated over the steam railroad tracks. See, so that was really commonplace for interurbans, and you might want to call our Sioux City elevated an interurban because it connected the downtown with an urban area in Morningside and picked up people in between. Another thing was some interurbans had joint ticketing with each other, one interurban with another. In other words, go back again, a town or city did not want the interurbans to compete with each other. They were to support each other. So they often had joint ticketing offices, and this precedes the joint ticketing efforts during World War I. And some steam railroads had joint ticketing with interurbans, and the interurbans would have their schedule match the arrival or departure of a steam train. So you see what's happening here. In some cases, there's arguments and even fisticuffs. In other places, cooperation. And even more surprising, you have some steam railroads, that will purchase and operate interurbans. Pennsylvania and New York Central railroads, two huge ones, actually purchased and operated interurbans to meet with their trains at various stations of the line. The New Haven operated so many interurbans that there was court action to break up that monopoly. So you have to the point of owning and operating, as we said before, the Southern Pacific actually owning the Pacific Electric. So it's very varied. everything from fisticuffs, building a diamond, well, a competition, if you will. And believe me, if you're going to have going from one town to another, a steam railroad or an interurban, people would take that interurban between the two towns. It's cheaper. Simple as that. And the service is more frequent. And here again, you may want to think in these terms. You took the interurban for a short distance to the nearest large town, but you took the steam railroad to a greater distance to other towns across the whole country. Let's use that as a beginning, a comparison contrast that I put together. I really haven't seen this anyplace. It was just sitting down one evening thinking, okay, we've done the study of the interurbans, and now let's use some memory and see what I could come up with steam railroads. Okay? Now again, for us to recall, the interurban, that word inter is important, picked up people between towns to bring them to town. Okay? Or bring people from a smaller town to a larger town, or a village to a larger town. In Iowa, you could say from Harcourt to Fort Dodge, or from Boxholm to Des Moines, something like that, okay? Now let's look at some of the other things, besides steam, distance, interurban, local, okay? The whole thing behind steam railroads, Baltimore and Ohio, or Charleston, what would they start with? Steam railroads started to bring farm produce to the city. Baltimore and Ohio get that farms from the Ohio Valley to feed the population of Baltimore and other eastern cities. So the whole impetus behind the steam railroad was freight. The impetus behind the interurban was passengers. Freight will come later on. Indeed, with freight, as with the Baltimore, Ohio, passengers were soon to follow. But steam started with freight, interurbans by and for passengers. Okay? Steam railroads needed a fairly level area. So when they were being built, they had to have cuts through hills and so forth to keep the track at a relatively small elevation. Either that or they'd have switchbacks going up and down mountains. The interurban, being much lighter, could actually follow the topography. So that's another contrast, and that's why the interurbans were so much cheaper to build. Oh, indeed. Steam railroads have longer trains. You could have 14 cars on a passenger train once they were developed by the 1890s for the steam line to heat them, and whatnot. Long distances again, comfortable seats, Pullman sleeping cars, and so forth. Well, the interurbans, usually one car, maybe two. Competition was out of going between cities as the competition was among steam railroads, because their franchises designated their frequency and they were not to compete with each other. Investment, obviously. Wall Street began. That was the beginning of Wall Street, was building the steam railroads in the 1840s. Investment with the Boston Board of Trade. Wall Street, Boston Board of Trade, they invested in railroads all throughout the nation. Not to mention some foreign investors too, particularly from England, that put their money into American railroads as they were building. As we said before, the interurbans were merely a local venture, local finance. And as we said, the steam railroads, because of their big financing, a good base, that even in their beginning was indeed around 40% would fail. The interurbans, well over 90% that fail. In fact, talking about just here in Sioux City, Larry Obermeyer mentioned to me that there was a proposed line between an interurban between Omaha and Sioux City. Of course, never got off the ground, or I remember I should say, it never got on the rail. I myself spent some time reading the articles of incorporation of the Niobrara, O'Neill, and Sioux City interurban. Again, articles of incorporation being filed and so forth, never built, never happened. So many of these occurred that way. In fact, there's even the story of a interurban being built and on its first day of operation went bankrupt. So you could see this difference in financing. Also, among the steam railroads, a few of them did have land grant loans from the federal or from the state for their construction. There was little or no state help at all for the interurbans. They were simply a local venture, locally franchised, if you will. Steam railroads, all kinds of comforts, indeed, by the interurban era, that is from the 1890s to the 1920s. Parlor cars, dining cars, Pullman, the Pullman sleeping car, and even the bedrooms coming into individual bedrooms on the Pullman by the 1920s. Indeed, barber shops on the car. You can even take a bath on the car. They had a bath car and so forth. All these amenities that were on a steam railroad. No such luck on the interurban. You had your seat, you went a short distance, that was about it. Only 2 or 3 companies ventured into some type of sleeping accommodation or dining on their train. Guaranteed no barbers on the interurban, if you will. As far as steam railroads, my goodness, almost unlimited passengers. People could stand in the vestibules of the cars, all the seats taken and so forth. Get on the train, get on there. If you could fit in, squeeze in, and believe me, I've done this traveling between Washington, D.C. and New York. And in Europe, I sat on my suitcase many times in the vestibule. On the interurban, there was no such demand for this type of accommodation. And indeed, if you were to have that whole thing filled, if you will, with people, I don't think the electric motor would be. I think it would be complaining a lot. Let me put it that way. Last but not least, our steam railroads liked to build spurs. That is a track that leaves the main track and ends in a dead end, does not rejoin the main track at the other end. And these spurs were built to factories, to businesses, and so forth. And this was kind of the lifeblood, if you will, of the freight business for railroads, where there's spurs and so forth. Even off a main line, if a business built off a main line, they would have to build a little spur off to that business. Interurbans did not like to build spurs. Again, in their origin, they thought in terms of passengers. They were not thinking in terms of freight until you get to the 1920s. So therefore, they would not think in terms of the freight business or building spurs. Either the main line or that was it. Spares were very difficult to construct. Okay. Now, as I promised, we should have some dessert, and that is talking about some photographs. I'd like to introduce some photos of interurbans and start with Sioux City, and this and the following photo are from the Sioux City Public Museum with permission to show. Sioux City in the 1890s, or before the 1890s, had like a cable car system, and if you look closely at this photo, you'll see cable written there. And there were mergers of these companies in the mid-1890s where the cable car company became electrified as a trolley and whatnot. Now, I'm showing this as an interurban because Sioux City will have these trolleys or trains, electric, going out to Riverside, going to Leeds, which originally was a separate town. Leeds was originally a separate town. So they were going distances outside of the downtown. And as I mentioned in the earlier talk, that part of the talk, that even Morningside was separate from the downtown of Sioux City, and it needed that connection, that rail connection over the railroad tracks. So indeed, one can make an argument, given definitions, that Sioux City had these, not just trolleys, but they function as interurbans. And in the book recommended by Bill Sibley, called Iowa Trolleys, they do have the line going to Riverside definitely as an interurban, absolutely. This is another Sioux City showing an open car, and this looks like the Floyd River Bridge, crossing the Floyd River, I am thinking that way because the picture of this photo of this bridge was in another photo, a little more recent from the one here. If so, if this is crossing the Floyd River, this would be going on to different parts of Sioux City beyond the downtown, which again you can call it perhaps an interurban. And here possibly is the car from Riverside crossing some type of small gully or whatever. If you look closely at the pole, it says, car stop on it. So it would stop to pick up passengers. And that's what they did. They simply picked up passengers along their line to take them from one place to another. This is the Central Iowa Railway, one of the photos from Mike Wendell with permission to use from the W.H. Andrew Train Rail Center and Museum in Boone. This is what you could see is a color photo. You could see how brightly colored they are, really interesting. It'd be interesting to ride and so forth. This is a steel body, this would be fairly modern, probably from the 1950s. This is the original Fort Dodge, Des Moines, and Southern as it approaches the High Bridge. What's interesting here is besides, of course, the interurban, and you could see the trolley line and so forth, here you have three cars functioning together. So this, you can see not just one car, but fairly often they would have three of these motor cars functioning together. And this is also Fort Dodge, Des Moines, and Southern. You can notice by the white flag, it's a special, and that it also would carry baggage, which was not uncommon at the time. Some even carried mail, depending upon their route. So this one had space for passengers and for baggage. And this again is a Fort Dodge, Des Moines, and Southern electric freight locomotive. The line, when it ended suspended passenger service, indeed, as we said, many of these lines in the 1920s sought freight as a means of income as its passenger numbers dwindled fairly rapidly. And this is the sign of a really quite a powerful electric freight locomotive. As I mentioned, one of the most famous lines was the Cincinnati and Lake Erie. For publicity, they had some runs that went at incredible speeds. This is from 1931. Still, for this line, it would have been, and it's still within its heyday. The Cincinnati and Lake Erie was a fairly substantial company, even in the early 1930s. So this will give you an idea of the design of their cars and passengers boarding. I believe it is at Dayton. Okay. This is the Charles City in Western. Charles City, Iowa, had a trolley interurban that linked 2 or 3 communities nearby to bring people into Charles City. Here again, you can see this car would be functional to carry not just passengers, but also baggage and perhaps even mail at one time. This is a sad picture of Pacific Electric. I'd hope to have maybe a better photo, but again, giving copyright and so forth. This is the one again. These are from the Andrew Museum and Center in Boone. This is showing the cars as the line went out of business, and they were simply stacked up. Really a sad photo, but I did want to have something to represent perhaps the largest, if you will, in terms of service and passenger service of these Interurbans. This is just a close-up of the motor box, or the driver's place, if you will, for the Interurban. In other words, these are the controls that would make the Interurban and trolley, same type electric controls, that controls the speed of the motor and the electricity flowing from the overhead wire into the motor. Fairly simple device, not complicated at all. Okay. This is an interior from Mount Pleasant, a John Bell photo. There are very few photos of the interior of these Interurbans, or very few that we know exist. And again, I have this photo through the permission of the Andrew Museum, Mike Wendell. And here you can see clearly the leather seats and how they are, perhaps as you would say, almost like a local bus today, huh? Kind of like, in other words, short distance travel. As you can see here, that the seats on the right hand, to our right hand viewing, are a little bit larger than those on the left, just a tad bit larger. You can see the clear story windows here. They're open up on top toward the ceiling for ventilation. That was common in a train car, even on the steam railroads. And of course, the lighting along the side. So this would be a typical Interurban car, let's say from around the World War I, early 1920s period. And this is a setting here, which is unidentified, that shows a 2-1 seating, and 2 on one side and the other. Again, you can see that these cars were narrow, a little bit more narrow than a train car, again, to accommodate the sharp turns on city streets. In other words, as they approach a city intersection, that turn will be shorter or much more steep than a turn on a steam railroad, a curve on a steam railroad. Again, these interior photos are very, as far as we know, there are not that many extant. Hopefully someone has a whole group of them in some attic someplace, and we'll be able to see them sometime in the future. Okay, thank you again for viewing the photos with us. Okay, we're at our conclusion. And of course, to refrain, to look at the Interurban era, a very short period, barely a generation, say from the 1890s to 1920s. By the 1920s, the Interurban era is over, actually given over to the automobile. Okay, that's what's going to happen. That is what's going to happen. But there's something important in this Interurban era which is critical. I want you to think back of one of the great magics of the train. To me, one of the great magics of the train is that if you sit back in your very comfortable seat and look out the window, it looks as if the landscaping is moving, not you. You're just sitting there and watching the world go by. It really is amazing. Just to be personal, one time I left Washington, D.C., and the leaves were just changing color, relatively warm temperature. Overnight, I woke up in Indiana with several inches of snow on the ground and more coming down, watching the whole country change, the whole landscape move outside my window. With the trolley, and maybe this is something why people like the trolley in the Interurban, is yes, you could look out the window, you're only going a short distance, but you could also see out the front. And that's going to be important. It's like when you're riding in your car and you're looking out of the windshield, front windshield of the car. This is going to be important for an incredible reason. Indeed, the Interurban is significant, yes, because it hastened that movement from the rural area to the town to the city. It meshed rural life with the town and city. The people on the farm were no longer months behind the rest of the world. Now they were becoming part of it. Oh, indeed, the car will do that in the 1920s and 30s with paved roads, granted. But the interurban brought that about a generation earlier. Now, the American interurban actually approached obsolescence before reaching its real maturity. Remember we said the technology ended with the steel cars and a little more powerful motors to move them. So really, their life was cut short. The lifespan was cut short. The automobile simply supplanted it, and the interurbans gave over their planning and original purpose to the automobile, and they did so successfully. In fact, they were hurt because it was the state and then later federal government that paved the roads that put the interurbans out of business. And of course, much later in the mid-20th century, are going to put the steam railroad passenger business out of business too. But the trolley lead wagon, the trolley car, the interurban, if you think it's a trolley, served an unexpected world, no, galaxy-changing purpose. Yes, it's going to change our whole perspective on everything. This is why. It was after 1900 when a clerk in Austria was sitting on a trolley to take him to the outskirts of town. He was looking out the window and looking out the front. It was dark. His trolley was stopped, and another trolley pulled alongside. And as his trolley began to accelerate, began to leave, leaving the other trolley behind, a question came to his mind. Were the beams of light on his trolley car that was accelerating, were those beams of light of his car moving faster than the light on the trolley stopped in the station? That clerk was Albert Einstein. And it was that question that propelled him to develop the theory of relativity. That the speed of light is the speed limit of the universe. And with that theory of relativity, with that theory of light, and that matter bends light, really, our whole perspective of physics changed. Our whole idea of relativism comes about. And it was inspired in the genius of Einstein when he was seated on the Vienna version of an interurban. So indeed, our interurban, the light, the trolley, has changed our perspective on the entire world. He was able to look out that front window, the trolley on the tracks. So the interurban, the trolley, is not obsolete. It has paved our way for our scientific future. Thank you. And now I would like to invite you to bring about discussion, comments, and questions through the Sioux City Railroad Museum. I'm sorry that I can be with you only this way today, but given circumstances, I think this is the best way to do it. And a great way indeed to continue the tradition of the museum to bring education on railroad history to the citizens of Sioux City, to the people of Iowa, indeed to anyone throughout the world who's interested. Thank you.
This is an uncertain time for all of us, including the Sioux City Railroad Museum. As is the case for so many historic sites and museums across the country, the Sioux City Railroad Museum is facing sudden financial hardship because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had to close the Railroad Museum to socially distance ourselves and protect our visitors, while also practicing other mitigation measures. Unlike the other museums in Sioux City, our operating costs are not covered by a local government subsidy or gaming tax revenues. We must earn our revenues through memberships, donations, and programming fees. We've heard from numerous friends and visitors at the museum who want to know how they can help us during this time. If you're inclined, we'd like to ask you to consider making a contribution today to the Sioux City Railroad Museum so that we can continue our work on our buildings, grounds, and exhibits while the museum is closed. To make a donation, all you have to do is visit www.siouxcityrailroadmuseum.org and click on the Donate button. We are looking forward to the time when we can all gather once again in our historic museum, anew with each other, walking side by side in the footpaths created by the craft workers and shopmen of long ago. We are deeply grateful for your generosity and support. We extend our best wishes for the health and safety of you and your family and friends.